Hi, my name is Avril Sorter and we're discussing CCNA Wireless. In this lesson, we want to take a look at one of the most important features when it comes to managing your very valuable RF resources, and that is how to configure the Cisco Radio Resource Management using your wireless LAN controller. So as you know, there are lots of issues with RF. So some of the ones that the Radio Resource Management will help to address is the issue of interference between access points that are operating on the same channel. So when does that occur? Well, it particularly occurs in the 2.4 gigahertz band, because in the 2.4 gigahertz band we only have 3 non-overlapping channels, i.e. in North America that's 1, 6 and 11. If you're in Europe, Japan, that would be 1, 7 and 13. And so what happens is that another access point, although not adjoining to it, it'll be fairly close, will be using the same channel. And so if you've got two access points that are using the same channel, they can interfere with each other. And so, if I control the power level on those access points, I can minimize the interference between access points operating on the same channel. Or if I'm in the 5 gigahertz band, there I've got a lot more channels that I can select from, but am I choosing the best channel? I may have deployed it and made my best guess, and now the RF environment, there's been some changes, and so maybe that's not the best selection anymore. And Radio Resource Management can help optimize my channel selection. And then there's propagation issues, as with anything with RF. When we transmit from that access point, we would really like that perfect circle around the access point for planning purposes, but we all know, because of reflective surfaces and obstacles, corridors, etc., you're going to have some areas where you haven't got coverage, i.e. you've got a hole in coverage, and some areas where you're covering where you don't need to cover. And so how do we optimize and make sure we've got the best coverage? And then we also have clients which are contending for the medium. So let's say you've got 20 clients connecting to an access point. They're going to compete for access to that medium, because you can only have one client receiving from the access point at any one point in time. So if I have 20 clients on one access point and no clients on the adjacent access point, that isn't really very smart. And I want to take those clients that are on the edge of the cell where I have overlapping coverage and move them to the access point which is lightly loaded. And so I want to start load balancing and managing my RF environment. And again, Radio Resource Manager is going to do that. So let me step through the 5 key features of Radio Resource Management on a Cisco access point. The first one is radio resource monitoring. So the access point literally will stop communicating with clients and will start scanning the channel. So it will scan other channels other than its own, and also different bands, and it will collect information about what it's hearing and feed that back to the wireless LAN controller. And that would include packets from rogue access points, any rogue clients, things that aren't recognized as legitimate access points and clients, interfering access points. Maybe you've got a business next door and is causing some interference. It's going to collect that information. Now, when it goes off the air, it's not communicating to the clients. However, by default, if you set it up to be in monitoring mode, it's only going to do this 0.2% of the time. So relatively little time off monitoring, but a huge potential gain in terms of then giving the information to the wireless LAN controllers such that they can set the right channel and power settings, etc. Then you've got dynamic channel assignment. And this is what I was talking about, where it says, oh, what is the best channel to put this access point on? And again, it's going to look at adjoining access points as well. And it can look at things like the noise level, the interference that's currently on that channel, the received signal strength that is getting from other access points that are on other channels. It can look at the utilization and the loading on that channel, and based on the RF characteristics right across the system, it will then say, okay, this access point should be on this channel, this access point should be on this channel. And not only will it do on a floor, but it also takes into account should there be any spillover from access points that may be on the floor above or below as well. So that can be really hard to assess when you're doing your site survey. And so it's really nice to have a tool that kind of does that assessment, comes up with some algorithms, and sets the best channel for your RF environment. Now, this monitoring, by the way, is happening dynamically, and so these changes of the channel can happen periodically. And when it changes the channel, it needs to notify all the clients, I'm now changing the channel, and then they will know when those channels will be changed. So there's minimum disruption in your network while it's executing those improvements. The next, and I'd mentioned this earlier, is your dynamic power control. Again, you make the best estimate when you do your site survey on what the best power is, and you always do your site survey to deploy the access point below the maximum power. But there are times where maybe you do have a coverage hole and you need to increase the power, or maybe you're causing another access point significant interference, and so you need to decrease the power. And so again, by making those assessments, I can actually increase or decrease the power a little bit on individual access points to optimize the RF environment. So what it's also going to help me do is detect holes in coverage. And the way it does that is looking at signal to noise ratios and saying, okay, is that below the threshold that I need it to be? And if it is, then what it does is it sends a coverage hole alert to the wireless LAN controller and exposing the area where it's getting the poor signal coverage. And then what you do is you just kind of look at where it's saying that there is a problem and see if that's coupled perhaps with a roaming problem, etc. So you can try and make an assessment of whether that really is a coverage hole problem, and then you can decide, oh, maybe I need to increase or lower the power, or maybe you need to put in another lightweight access point. And the last one is then the client and the network load balancing. Now, in your deployment, you would have had overlapping cell coverage, which is particularly important for roaming because you don't want a client losing coverage. So you always define your access points to have some level of overlapping coverage, more for voice and less if it's just data only. And so what the load balancing is doing is talking about when you've got a lot of clients in one area. And that would happen if you've got conference rooms and people get together for a meeting, or cafeteria and everybody's eating there at lunchtime. And what it can do is it'll just force some subscribers off onto another access point that's surrounding it, and that allows the other clients that are connecting to the access point to get a better performance, better throughput by pushing those other devices off. And with any luck, you can load balance everybody across the network. Of course, life's never that perfect, and people do congregate, as I said, at lunchtime or for meetings. But at least it attempts to set up the best performance given where people are and given the performance you have of your wireless LAN. So if you have many controllers in your network, then what you want to do is you want to take a look at the RF environment across the access points across those controllers, because as in this diagram, I've got access points that are right next to each other which are being managed by two different controllers. And so to do that, I have to form an RF group. And on this slide, I'm explaining how the RF group forms. So we're going to start at the bottom with step 1. Now, before I start, it's very important to understand that you need to configure each of the controllers with an RF group name. Right? If you don't do that, this won't work. So make sure you configure the RF group name in your wireless LAN controller. And to do that, you just go into the controller tab and onto the general page. And if you look down, one of the names is RF network name. And that's where you create your RF group name. Okay, so let's assume that you've done that. What then happens is the wireless LAN controller sends the access point a secret, a shared secret. And what happens is that the access points will periodically send out what's called neighbor messages, and they're sent out over the air periodically, and surrounding access points will be able to hear those. And they hear them and they note the signal strength, and if it's more than 80 dBm or stronger, then it will say, okay, I need to pay attention to this neighborhood message. And because of the shared secret that's sent out from the wireless LAN controller, it says, oh, this is a valid message. So in this way, some rogue access point can't start sending out these neighbor messages and confusing the radio networks because of this shared secret. And so the access points hear each other's neighbor messages and collect information about the signal strength and the name of the access point that they're hearing. They then tell the wireless LAN controller everything that they can hear, including if the surrounding access points are managed by another wireless LAN controller. So when the controller gets this information, it goes, wow, not only do I have all of this information about the RF environment, I also know all the other wireless LAN controllers that are within my RF group. The wireless LAN controllers then elect one of these controllers to be the group leader. This is something you cannot actually configure. It's actually dynamically selected. And that's the wireless LAN controller that's then going to run all of the RR algorithms. So step 5, it churns through the algorithm from the information gathered from all of the access points in the RF group. And then based on that information, it then sends out to the other wireless LAN controllers, here's the recommended power and channel settings for your access points. And then the wireless LAN controller will then update the configuration in each of the access points. So now my network has been optimized for the best power and channel setting. Now, how often is this done? So they run at a specified interval, and that interval is set by default at 600 seconds. So that's every 10 minutes. And of course you can change that because the default value. That's altogether pretty cool. Now, one last thing, remember, there's a difference between RF group and mobility group. Do not confuse them. This is the RF group for the radio resource management. So in this demonstration, of course, we're now going to take a look at the radio resource management settings on my wireless LAN controller. So I'm back in my wireless LAN controller GUI interface on the monitor screen, and we want to take a look at the status of my RF group. So to do that, I'm going to come into wireless, and I will look at my 802.11a. You can see the settings are the same for my BGN radio, so I'm going to look at my AN radio. Here's my radio resource management, and the first one is the RF grouping. So I'm going to click on that. So this shows me all the information about my RF group, and you can see the group mode here. So it shows the role, so I could set it to the leader here. Below it, I only have one controller, so it's set to leader. Here you can see the intervals that I was talking about, the 600 seconds. And below here you can see the status of when it was last updated. So let me just refresh that. There we go. Since I was talking, it has already refreshed itself. Now if I want to configure the transmit power control, I would come here. It defaults here to automatic. I could set it to on demand, which means it will periodically evaluate the power, but it won't actually do anything until I actually hit the invoke button here. So you can see if I turn this on, then it will allow me to invoke the power. So on demand evaluates but doesn't actually change anything, whereas automatic will change it. And fixed will prevent the power changing at all. And here you can see I can set my minimums and maximums, etc. Now to configure my dynamic channel selection, I would select here, and you can see automatic, and you can see the interval time of how often it's going to do it. I can freeze it here, and again, if I freeze it, I can still invoke. It will still do an assessment, but then I can invoke it periodically, or I can turn it off. You can see here it's avoiding foreign access point interference. So this would be if I was adjoining a business and they were on a channel, I can avoid the channel they're on by selecting that button. If I select the avoid Cisco AP load, it'll take into account other lightweight access points when it's assigning the channels. So that's a good thing. So I'm going to enable that one. Here you can see it's going to avoid noise from non-802.11, and here's the avoid persistent non-Wi-Fi interference. I'm going to leave those ones. Here's where I can select my channel sensitivity. Low means it's not going to be very sensitive to changes in the RF environment. Medium, moderately sensitive, and high would mean any changes, or very, very sensitive to any changes in the environmental factor. The default is medium, depends on your environment. I don't like my channels changing a great deal if I have a good static environment and not much interference. So I quite often will change that, especially in the 5 gigahertz band. And here you can see the channel width algorithm here. If you choose 40 megahertz here, make sure that you choose the primary channel and a secondary channel, because you'll now need two 20 megahertz channels in operation. So that's a good one to check. And here you can see from my channel list here, I can then select the channels that I want to be using. And you can see it's just using the Uni 1 and the Uni 2 bands. It's not using the Uni 2 extended, and is selecting from the upper Uni band. And so here you can see I can select here if I want to use the extended Uni 2 bands. Now because this is an indoor access point, I would actually turn those off. I don't want it to select one of those, but I might want it to select the Uni 2 extended band. So it gives me the opportunity here to select the channels, particularly important if you go to a 40 megahertz deployment. Now an event-driven RRM is very important if you have an access point which can operate as a clean air enabled access point, because that one will be able to do more advanced features such as looking at interference and the causes of interference. And so if you have, like I have, 3500 access points and you want to turn on that capability, then you want to turn on this feature. Turn that on. And then below it is going to give me the ability to say how sensitive do I want it. So I can select low, medium and high, just like we did for the other thresholds. I can also here configure the coverage. And here I can configure what is acceptable receive signal strength. And you'll definitely want to change these, because notice it's the same for data and for voice. So for voice, for instance, I might want to say, hey, I want 76 dBm. Right? And here I can also set the minimum failed client count per access point and the coverage exception. And here in the last one I want to show you is just the general tab here. And again, I'm setting the profile threshold for any traps. Here is now where I can start looking at my noise interference, rogue detection, clear air monitoring, and I can select the channels, and here I can select, oh no, all the country channels. I can select the ones that I selected through the dynamic channel selection, or I can just say all channels even if they're not valid to be operated in this country. I'm going to leave it as country channels here. Here I can talk about how often I want the monitoring intervals to occur and the neighborhood packet frequency that's going to be set. And again, if I play with this and need to set it back, I've got a good old reset here. Notice, of course, this is a very important one. Clean air monitoring is only done if I put my AP in monitoring mode. And do you remember where we do that? In the wireless tab under APs, there is the mode. And remember, I showed that to you in the previous demo. Go back and check that one. I hope you found this valuable. It is very, very important to be managing your RF environment and to understand these things in order to optimize the performance of your wireless LAN system. Radio Resource Management, RRM, this is the technology that Cisco has that allows for the dynamic adjustment of things like my transmit power. I can change my channel allocation on those access points. And what I'm trying to do here is optimize the network for its RF environment. And so it's like a self-healing that it continues to run, because as my RF environment is changing, I will adapt the access point configuration settings accordingly. I hope you enjoyed this lesson. Like I said, it's one of my favorite. Just get in there and play with these advanced settings on your wireless LAN controller, and it is just as much fun as playing with the settings on an autonomous mode access point, but you get to do it in a central way and drive it down to all of your lightweight access points. Thank you for listening.